Hello, and welcome back to the Important Questions. I'm your host, Tom Schallenberger, and today we are discussing the topic of lasagna. If you have two lasagna and you stack one on top of the other, how many do you have? In the booth, we have our poster purveyor, Andrew,
And Pastina.
arguing the pro one lasagna side, and our own lasagna correspondent, Andrew, arguing the pro two lasagna case. Lasagna correspondent, your opening statement.
Thanks for having me on, Tom. To put it simply, the reason why I'm here today is to protect our way of life. My colleague on the other side, along with Big Lasagna, wants to promote a life of excess and a life of waste. If they get their way, Americans will no longer have the freedom to enjoy multiple lasagna. It will be only one lasagna for everyone.
Poster purveyor, your response?
Thank you, Mr. Schwallenberger, for having me on as well. Um, Despite my disagreements with the fellow sitting across from me, I think that we can come to some common ground here, and hopefully we can make some progress on the one lasagna side of the argument. Thank you.
All right, we'll start things off with an open-ended question. When does a lasagna become a lasagna? Lasagna correspondent, you'll take the first lead on this.
Well, I think it's rather obvious. The components of a lasagna are pasta, sauce, presumably maybe a meat filling or, whatever filling, and then just layering it on, throwing it in the oven, and then once it exits the oven, it is a lasagna.
I'm shocked with the cavalier language you use to describe the art of lasagna making, and purely from a rhetorical perspective, I think that's a dangerous thing to do for your argument. For your sake, Mr. Lasagna correspondent, pardon me. Uh, by your very nature, you are demeaning the craft which you purport to represent.
How is he
I
demeaning the
wouldn't say
craft?
demeaning. I would say more simplifying. It's
Oh,
I think the beauty of it is that it is simple, and
oh.
something so simple can be so complex at the same time.
The art of lasagna deserves to be elevated. It can be popularized. Well, I have no opposition to that, but it deserves to retain some of the purity and structure. And I think this is the primary point at which our opinions are irreconcilable. Is that you believe that lasagna is simply some mechanistic construction, whereas I see it, and my colleagues on the same side as me see it as well an art form, a cultural expression of a particular Italian American heritage.
I think you're putting words in my mouth, sir.
Words in your mouth?
No,
Do we need to
I think
roll back the
I think
tapes and
I think we
re-examine exactly
agreed.
what you said
I think
regarding
I
the
I, I, I think
construction
if
of
we
lasagna? This
I,
this is a one moment. One moment. This is a clear and precise example of you type of people. You you
Whoa, 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 whoa. We'll not have that kind of language. This is a civil debate. Please refrain from any name calling or other derogatory insults. Please keep it
uh,
on the
I
topic of
I
lasagna.
assure you,
I'm up for
Mr.
rebuttal.
Schallenberger,
I would
Mr.
like to rebuttal.
Schallenberger, I one moment, Mr.
No,
Correspondent.
no,
Mr. Schallenberger, I assure you that this is not ad hominem in the least. This is simply an observation on my part of the type of people who maintain this one lasagna stance.
Please keep it. Refrain from making insults to the other party. Keep it on topic.
I'm gonna butt in here since there's a little bit of silence because apparently my colleague on the other side does not respect discussion and would rather speak over legitimate arguments instead of responding to them. He suggests to roll back the tape, so we should roll back the tape. And when we roll back the tape, I said that lasagna is beautiful. And it is beautiful because it is simple, and you can do so much more with it. The structure, just it, it's just beautiful.
I would caution you against calling me a disrespectful representative of the one lasagna stance, as I have no
No,
disrespect for
you've
you. I
given
have
me no
no
reason to say otherwise.
I have no disrespect for you, Mr. Correspondent. I only have disrespect for wrong opinions. And I
Well,
think that's a very important divide to understand. Mr. Schallenberger, you were speaking. I'm sorry.
that's perfectly fine. I appreciate both your stances, but you both missed the question entirely. When does a lasagna become a lasagna? Mr. Correspondent?
Oh, I think I already answered this before my colleague on the other side decided to butt in with some personal attacks. I believe a lasagna is a lasagna when it comes out of the oven.
I would happen to agree with that. I would happen to agree with that perspective.
Then is a frozen lasagna a lasagna?
Well, I think that they could be classified as perhaps a proto lasagna, but I think that the lasagna starts to become a lasagna at the moment it's placed in the oven.
I think the qualities of frozen food is that they are pre-cooked, so they're almost partially cooked before they get frozen. So I would say that it might already be a lasagna before it even hits your freezer.
Continuing on this train of thought, if I have just cooked a lasagna and defrosted and reheated a frozen lasagna, I stack them on top of each other. How many lasagna do I have?
Well, clearly, you have two lasagnas.
Clearly, you have one lasagna.
Can we break this down a bit more? Pasta purveyor. Why do we have one lasagna?
Well, let us examine the components of a singular lasagna before we advance to the case of two becoming one. So, as the as Mr. Correspondent has previously set out, Mr. Schrollenberger, you do have typically a layer of um, wheat-based paste or a sheet of pasta, if you so desired. Then a sauce, then a cheese, perhaps a meat, and that is repeated. And of course, we wouldn't leave that uncapped. We would place another sheet of pasta, but in this case, the substrata of the lasagna are or is uh, identical as it stacks up, and we can imagine that in this case that you have set out that uh, the second lasagna becomes ingratiated in the first lasagna um, when it is, or co-ingratiated if you desire to use more specific language, um, by virtue of the repetition of the substrata.
Mr. Correspondent, your stance on this?
See, I think that my colleague on the other side is complicating the argument too much. He's using all this fancy language. He's trying to trick you, the listener, to thinking that he's right because he uses big words. But I'm going to pose a very simple math equation that we all have learned on day one. 1 plus 1 is 2. There are two lasagnas because the process of a lasagna becoming a lasagna is that it comes, as we said earlier, comes out of the oven. What happens in the oven is that the sauce and the pasta and the fillings, they're all heated up together. They're all joined together. They come out, and you've got a beautiful, beautiful pasta dish. And you can't make and to claim that if you unceremoniously drop a lasagna on top of another lasagna, and all of a sudden you made another lasagna, it just doesn't make sense to me.
Mr. Correspondent, to modify a particular popular turn of phrase, what happens in the oven does not stay in the oven in this case.
So you do concede that if I had two lasagna and I put them back in the oven, they would then become one lasagna if I stacked them on top of each other?
I could concede that, but that's just garbage cooking. I'm saying the question at hand is if you literally physically had two lasagnas, you just stacked the lasagna on top of each other, and that was it. Then
Well,
you don't have one lasagna. You've got a lasagna stacked on top of a lasagna.
well, let's use proper appropriate language here. Multiple lasagna is lasagne, and regarding the topic of language and your attacks against me, um, these rodomontades which you levy against me are not indications of some sort of um, uh, rhetorical consideration on my part. I'm simply using the language which the culinary art deserves. Um, I don't think that we should debase the art to common language.
Now, Mr. Correspondent, I'd like to pose a question directly to you. Why does wedding cake logic not apply here? In wedding cakes, you can stack multiple layers on top of each other, and it's still one wedding cake. Why does lasagna differ?
Well, it's an interesting hypothetical, and I'd like to respond that we're not talking about wedding cakes here. We're talking about lasagna. Um, I think for a wedding cake, it's a process. You don't just stack cakes on top of cakes. You ice them. You have some kind of design. The cakes get fundamentally smaller as you go on the top, or whatever as you please. Whatever you want your wedding cake to look like. But then there is effort put in that to make a cake.
Mr.
It,
Schallenberger,
it,
I must respond to that
putting
comment.
lasagna on top of a lasagna, what kind of effort does that make? You're just plopping it on there.
Mr. Purveyor, you have 30 seconds to respond.
This is typical of the hypocrisy demonstrated by your people. If you,
Well, again,
you
Mr. Purveyor,
I'm speaking of a perspective. I am speaking of
I
a
will not
perspective.
tolerate that kind of language here. Please refer to them as the two lasagna party.
The two lasagna crowd, so it were, is so willing to violate the individual sanctity of lasagna when it appeals to them. They say that wedding cake logic doesn't apply in this case, but they refuse to use the appropriate language to refer to lasagna as a culturally relevant and an important part of the Italian American heritage.
I'd like to submit for the record that that response had nothing to do with my response. He just my colleague on the other side is just spitting nonsense, and it somehow forms coherent sentences.
Well, I can assure you that one of us indeed is spitting nonsense.
We'll move on from this topic and approach our last topic of the day. Is there a compromise that we can come between you two and acknowledge that there are states where we can have both a single lasagna and two separate lasagnas at the same time? A Schrodinger's lasagna, perhaps. Mr. Correspondent,
The, I
your first response.
think the notion of that idea is ridiculous. The entire principle behind Schrodinger's cat is that the box is covered. You don't know what's happened to the cat. The cat is either alive or dead. In terms of lasagna, we see the lasagna. We
Before
see
you
it.
respond, Mr. Purveyor, I'd like to respond, because that was a direct attack against my question here. You don't see it. You cannot see the cheese and the barrier between the two lasagna that may have combined it into one lasagna.
I'm starting to think that we don't have an impartial moderator here.
I have been completely impartial this entire time.
Well, no, you're going after my answer. You asked a question, I'm giving you an answer, and you're all of a sudden attacking my answer because you don't like it.
I'm not
Personally,
attacking your answer. I am posing a hypothetical.
I think it was a wonderful question, Mr. Schallenberger.
Well, go out and wax poetic, good sir.
Mr. Purveyor, what is your response to the question?
Sadly, I'm not sure that there is much compromise that can be held between these two parties, especially as demonstrated by my, although he is my opponent on this occasion, I would rather think of him as a colleague. But he has demonstrated the fact that there is little interest in compromise from his side of the aisle, and I suppose I must respect that. And until he uses the appropriate language to refer to lasagna and specific lasagna as the artistic creation, which it is, divinely inspired, I'm afraid that there will be no seeking out of compromise from my party either.
Well, I do appreciate both of you for coming on the Important Questions podcast, and I thank you for your time. Now, next week, we'll turn our focus to straws. Are there two holes or one hole? Until next time, everybody.